Hey, hello everyone, and welcome officially. Uh, a couple of ground rules before we get started. If you could please remain muted throughout the talk. We would still love to have your questions, but if you could put those in the chat, we will circle back to them at the end of the talk. I'm Nick Lilly. I work for the University of Chicago Press, but this is not about me. It is about Lina Zeldovich's absolutely hilarious and fascinating book, The Other Dark Matter, which you may be able to see if I can hold this properly, and which I gave to my father for Christmas. But I want to introduce our two speakers real fast, and then I'm going to duck into the background. Lina Zeldovich is a writer and editor specializing in the journalism of solutions, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Reader's Digest, Smithsonian, Popular Science, Scientific American, Atlantic, and Newsweek, among many other outlets. An immigrant from the former Soviet Union, she lives in New York City and keeps a compost pile in her backyard. Her conversation partner today is Shawn Shafner. Shawn is an artist, educator, and activist based in Washington, D.C. He is the founder of the People's Own Organic Power, aka POOP Project, an organization that uses art, theater, and education to promote critical conversations about sustainable sanitation for the person, planet, and world community. His own book on this topic, Know Your Shit, What Your Crap is Telling You, will be released in March of this year. Before I sign off, I'm going to put a link to the book at the Seminary Co-op in the chat. So if you've not yet purchased a copy, please do take a look at that. They are a partner bookstore here on Chicago's campus. So without further ado, I will mute myself and fade into the background.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Nicholas. And Lina, hello, welcome.
Oh, hi there.
Time to shine. Da, 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 da.
Oh, and by the way, meet my two faithful assistants. Poop had 1 and Poop had 2. Why do I have them? When I need to get in character and think poo, I put on one of them. Seriously.
That's amazing. I, of course, am wearing my I'm a Pooper shirt and have both. I'm like double fisting Poop books. I've got your copy in one hand. I've got my book that I just got the first preview copy of in the other. And actually, I have a number of other Poop books. Barbara Penner's Bathroom, Lawrence Wright's Clean and Decent, that are all making the back. We've got our libraries. Well, it's always a pleasure to get two fecophiliacs in a Zoom room together because we can really dive in. And I'm excited because I know there's probably a lot of people who are maybe more, poop curious, a little more like, I've heard about this other dark matter and I'm not sure if I'm ready. and so maybe that's a great place to begin our conversation. And just to say again, thank you so much to Lina for inviting me here, and to the University of Chicago Press and Seminary Bookstore, and Nicholas for that intro, and everyone for joining us. But to bring us in, Lina, I'm wondering if you'll talk a little bit just about how you became interested in this topic. I can't imagine it's every author's dream to go, one day, I'm going to grow up and write a book about poop. So right. How'd you get here?
Well, that's a great question. And people asked me when I was writing the book, like, why on earth of all the topics? And so as I was writing it, I realized I should probably explain it in chapter 1 so that it's like crystal clear. How did I get here? And so my first chapter in the book is exactly about that. And so the easiest thing is to just read a couple of passages.
Yeah, please.
So my first chapter is titled How I Learned to Love the Excrement. Every fall, my grandfather would set off to do 2 things: prepare our small family farm for the long Russian winter and empty out our septic system. He would don his sturdy overalls and heavy-duty gloves, both gray as the rainy sky above, tie 2 old beat-up buckets to long, thick ropes, and head out to our sewer tank, buried by the fence surrounding our property. As he opened the pit, ringed with garden weeds and stinging nettles, the stink would slowly waft through the air, settling over our land like a little stomach-churning cloud. Yet my nose would soon get used to it, and I wouldn't be bothered by it at all. I even wanted to help, but my grandmother wouldn't let me near the pit. She was afraid I was going to fall in. We could have called the service to empty it, but my grandfather wouldn't let all this riches to go to waste. He had a system. He would spend a day or 2 dipping buckets into the full brown liquid and distributing it over our land. Sometimes he carried the buckets by hand. Sometimes he balanced them on the karamisla, an arched wooden pole placed over his shoulders to distribute the weight evenly. He walked slowly to avoid splashing the stuff onto his clothes and boots. He didn't just dump the sludge wherever. He poked small holes in the strawberry and tomato patches where plants were already shriveled, expecting winter, and poured the goo into them. He would dig little trenches around the apple trees and emptying their buckets onto their roots. And he also dumped the buckets into one of his compost pits, adding to the already accumulated dead plants, leaves, and our kitchen food scraps. The compost pits operated on a rotating schedule. At the end of the season, he'd close them up for the current one for a couple of years, leaving it to ferment and biodegrade. When he opened it again 2 seasons later, all the original biomass was gone. The pit was full of soft black dirt, teeming with fat, lazy earthworms that crawled around slowly and lazily, so heavy from all that food. The sewage odor was gone too. Instead, the pit smelled of rich, fertile soil, spring, and the promise of the next harvest. And it made me hungry because I thought of all the food we were going to grow with it. You have to feed the earth just like you feed people, he used to say. And I thought the whole world did the same because it made sense. It was so beautiful, so nature-like. You take from the earth, you give back to the earth. Imagine my shocker when I grew up and learned that the rest of the world, pretty much, most of the people, didn't want anything to do with their poop. So
Yes, I feel like we're at a book reading, so snaps are in order. Did you have that last bit memorized? Were you reading that off of the page, or?
No, I am reading out of the book. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It was like,
last bit. No, I just sort of said it. I start thinking about it and I remember how things were, and it's like, God damn, it's so beautiful. How can I explain the rest of the world? It's beautiful. It's how it should be. It's natural. It's that classic, circular agriculture that the world is talking about now. But it was our circular agriculture back then without any fancy words. It just worked.
I would love to know, if folks who are watching live want to put into the chat any words of reaction that you had listening to that, because I know for myself, it's like it's almost tactile. There are smells that you're writing about. There are textures you can sort of feel in this way that is, is kind of hilarious and uncomfortable sometimes, but also, as you said, gets to this kind of beauty of what it means to have this intact nutrient cycle. And also that family connection, I think, is a really heartwarming part of the book. So I'm wondering, maybe if folks want to write those in, in the meantime, like, how did you think about how to write this topic in a way that would make it a little more appealing, or at least help to sort of declaw some of the more unappealing aspects of it?
Yeah. So, well, humor was a huge chunk of it, pardon the pun. It was clear to me that you couldn't write about these topics without humor. You had to make people laugh, because absolutely universally, in any and every language and culture, they're toilet jokes. They're their own, jokes, but they exist everywhere. And this is what really unites and connects all humanity, regardless of where you are, where you live, what you eat, what, God you believe in. Absolutely every single, human on earth does it. And by the way, this is why my poop hat's got that rainbow colors. That's very much for a reason. That's what unites humanity.
Yeah. I see Miley just wrote in the comments, it was so refreshing to hear this perspective. It's fundamental, and we've made it too convenient to flush and forget. But I think you're bringing in this both very, it seems sort of antiquated, the way that your grandfather was taking care of this sewage. I mean, even, it's actually funny, right? It's not sewage because it never went into a sewer. So it shows, though, how within just a small span of time, the way that so many of us have thought about this product has changed immensely over this time. So, and that's come with a lot of challenges. And I feel like your book is essentially, I think this was mentioned in your bio, it's a book about the solutions and what's really possible. But in order to talk about solutions, we also have to talk about problems. So I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit about some of the really critical challenges that are hiding behind the taboos and the giggles and things with poop.
Yeah, absolutely. So roughly, I would divide the challenges into two categories. So in the developing world, sanitation is a huge issue. Um, Quite often, there are no centralized ways to process waste and make it harmless. So, left outside to its own devices, I talk about it in the book, a pile of poo, you know, begins to endanger humans almost immediately because all
Mm,
kinds of pathogens, swarm in, lay their eggs, multiply. That untreated dark matter leaches into groundwater, eventually into drinking water, causes all kinds of disease and outbreaks and epidemics.
mm,
In the developed world where we are, that is no longer a problem, practically nowhere. But we've got a different problem that is far less obvious, and that's why we've sort of managed to ignore it for such a long time. So what we have here is something entirely different that scientists call the redistribution of nutrients on the planet, or the metabolic rift. And that's a
mm.
kind of really interesting and tricky topic. So especially for those of us who live in colder climates. I'm in New York right now. Yeah, some folks in Chicago, you're in DC. It's snow. It's white-ish outside. Nothing's going to grow right now. So where does our food come from during this time? It comes from
Mm.
other places. It comes from Florida, California, South America, maybe even from Africa. I don't know. But it grows someplace else on this fields, taking all these nutrients out of the soil. Then it's trucked or shipped or flown to us using fossil fuels. And then we eat it and excrete it.
Mhm.
And it goes somewhere, right? Usually that outflow flows into the nearest body of water. So here's what happens. We've taken nutrients from someplace, and then we deposit them in our own dark matter someplace else. So this is what happens with the sewage. Usually the wastewater treatment plants, there's two things are divided. Water goes one way, biosolids go the other.
Mm.
But a lot of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, still remain in that water. It's clean,
Mhm.
it's pathogen free. In some places it's so clean you can drink it, but it's definitely clean enough to release into a lake or a river. But it takes all this nutrients with it,
Mhm.
and it deposited in lakes, rivers, oceans. And what do these nutrients do? They fuel growth of whatever is there. Quite often it's toxicology blooms, um, and some other plants. And these plants suck out oxygen out of the water, and then the lakes and rivers start to rot. I mean, that's that stinky smell that you sometimes get, like near a
Mm.
lake. It shouldn't be there in normal, Mother Nature kind of way. So what we're constantly doing is we're shifting these nutrients from one place to another. The end result, the farmland gets depleted. It needs constant fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, and rivers and oceans start dying because we are over fertilizing them.
Right, right. It's like this thing that is a fertilizer becomes a pollutant because now it's in the water.
The water.
I mean, yeah, and creating these challenges. I feel like the Rich Earth Institute in Vermont, which is involved in urine diversion, collecting the urine to take that nitrogen and phosphorus, put it on farms before it gets into the water stream. They have a statistic about how you can basically regrow your diet from the fertilizers that come out of your body. And I always think that's a really great example of like, if whatever you ate is coming in, and those like the same caloric value or so of nutrients is coming back out and can grow that same diet over and over again. But unless, as you're saying, we're sort of taking from column A and then redistributing over into columns C, D, E, F, and ocean.
Yeah.
And you really got pretty hands-on with a lot of this. I mean, I feel like hands-on, nose on, boots on, and it especially feels appropriate since we're hosted by Chicago organizations to talk a little bit about what you did with the Marine Biological Laboratory in the Marshlands there. Can you talk about that experience?
Sure. So MBL is in Chicago University are affiliated, so I thought it was like important to mention it. So yeah, I was a fellow there, a journalist fellow, I believe in 2017, and the whole point of the fellowship was to study to what extent nitrogen overloading, it's an industry term, can destroy coastal marshes. And it turns out that it can destroy them quite a bit. And, the group that we were working with has been working on this topic for like 10 plus years, and they've had some really interesting measurements. So we went out with them into the marsh, and we dug in. We put on weight waders up to here.
Oh my gosh.
The water
into the marsh.
into the marsh, right? We caught fish and little mummy chogs. We caught some crabs and other creatures. We measured the amount of nitrogen in them. They actually have more nitrogen in them than they would like in a clean water. We listened to the marshes breathing, which was a totally fascinating subject, because marshes, just like meadows, forests, and ecosystem, do indeed breathe. Just like a healthy forest removes carbon dioxide from the air, replacing with oxygen, so should a healthy marsh. But when marshes are decaying, they respire differently. They rot. So instead, they exhale carbon dioxide. You can measure the amounts of carbon dioxide they exhale. So, for example, there were like 3 different sites. One was healthy, one was so-so, and one was like really seriously rotting. So it's interesting what nitrogen does to coastal marshes. It over-fertilizes them to the point that plants start growing like crazy. It's not a good thing, it turns out, because they grow very tall, but their roots grow very shallow, like they're very weak. There's too much food. You don't have to grow serious, robust roots. And roots is what's holding the marsh together. So if the roots disappear, the marsh falls apart. Why is it important? Who cares about a marsh? It's not a beautiful forest, it's not your redwood. Well, apparently it's very important, because along the coast, marshes is what protects you from flooding. When the tide surges, rise, the waves sort of sink into the marsh. The marsh is not there, the place to sink. Another reason is a lot of juvenile fish and other marine life starts their life in there, and they come out. So we destroy the marsh, we destroy the fish. None of them are apparent very quickly. It takes like years, if not decades, to get there, to realize that. And I was very grateful to be sort of at the end of that project where all this was basically kind of known, and we just soaked up all that wisdom, and it became a chapter in my book.
I love it. And it just makes, when you talk about the marsh breathing, it's just like that cycle in a way. I often think part of what draws me to this topic is we are bodies within bodies within bodies, and I have an individual body, which is full of all these little teeny cell bodies that are both my cells, not my cells, right? I live in an urban body with a house that breathes through its vents and has a heart through its boiler and all of those things. And the ways that those connect, that there is no, as you point out beginning, if we take our nutrients over here, dump them over here, the larger body, even if this body seems fine, the larger body's out of balance somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think and part of what makes it such a complicated topic and so worthy of fantastic investigative journalism like yours is it's a nested sort of challenge. And you talked a little bit about what's happening in the developed world, the global South, and also we should acknowledge there's a lot of people in this country, in the United States, who don't have access to toilets because they're unhoused or their septic system is failing, which a ton of those are. But despite the sometimes challenges of our wastewater treatment system, it keeps all of us relatively healthy. Whereas for folks in sub-Saharan Africa and much of Asia, the numbers are pretty staggering, right?
Staggering. Yeah, close to a little, about 800 to 900, depending on the year. Statistic changes a little bit, according to World Health Organization. Close to 1 million people a year still die from sanitation issues, and a lot of the sanitation issues come from untreated water. From sewage that is not being treated, eventually, finds its way into into drinking water. The CDC's numbers are even higher. Their numbers are like over 2,000 children die from diarrheal diseases daily, and
wow.
That's totally mind-boggling. All right, so we're going to finish our conversation today, and go have dinner and whatever, and by the end of the day, 2,000 children are going to be dead.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. It's really intense. And and I think one of the statistics or one of the images that really struck with me from the book too, and you sort of mentioned this in a way with your grandmother, I guess, saying like, don't go out there, you're going to fall in, which
Yeah,
is that people, in places where the system is just a hole in the ground, there are a lot of people,
yeah.
children especially, for whom that becomes a very fatal situation.
It's, it is a real danger, which I came across, when I was reporting in Madagascar. Um, Mothers would not let their children go to their outhouses until children are big enough that there's no way they can fall in. And
Mm.
that's like, past the 8, 9, whatever. It is a real danger. And like, it was another really, mind-boggling and eye-opening moment for me, because when we think of dangerous for our children, it's walking down the street to
Oh my
alone,
God.
right?
Right.
Right? You're afraid to use your toilet.
Yeah.
It's a totally different thing.
But it underscores the importance of, and I think we'll begin to get to these solutions in just a moment, of why I think in that context, it was a mother saying, thank goodness for this new toilet that we've got, because my child can use it. I'm not afraid. And I think it's tricky again in a nested problem scenario, because we've learned for a while from the NGO world, the international development world, that it's not as simple as coming to Madagascar and giving them some latrine and saying, here you go. That often doesn't work. And you categorize, or you talked about a story in the book that I think a lot of people still don't know about, which is some of that kind of colonial attitude happening on the shores of the US with the poop police a couple hundred years. Or give us some context for what this story is about.
So I'm trying to remember the exact dates when that was happening. So I think it was happening maybe in the early 1900s, or late 1800s. So at that time, American cities, as well as many European cities, were sort of modernizing their plumbing and their sewage system, like putting down like miles and miles of pipes underneath the city to direct all this output somewhere. And a similar but very different effort was also happening in the Indian reservations, where installing the sewage system wasn't really possible. So instead, the residents were taught to build latrines, and the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs, it sounds really awful right now, but that was the authoritative body at the time, hired thousands of young women to travel to this reservation, visit these people's homes, and instruct the residents how to keep their houses and outhouses clean. So these matrons dropped in and explained like why squatting underneath the tree was wrong and squatting over a latrine hole was better. And they measured various states and levels of cleanliness in the house. Like overall cleanliness was 10 points, but the excrement disposable cleanliness was worth 50. So in many ways, it was essentially a form of poop police, and people didn't like it. They didn't want to live by these rules because they were used to their own ways of dealing with it. So, and, there's, the person who really did a lot of research in that is Daniel Gerling at Augustana University. And what was really interesting about his thesis, he was also talking about Native American children brought to attend boarding schools, and they had to learn the proper toilet etiquette, such as using flushing toilets. And so some of them thought that it was a huge waste of water. So guess what? 100 years later, we're talking about the same phenomena. And now realizing our toilets are a waste of water.
And it just seems like bodies within bodies, we're spiraling through this history. It's like we've done one thing, we tried a different thing, we go back, we go forward. It really is quite cyclical. And I think that poop police story also underscores, and again, in this cyclical way that we see it happening in through communities that don't currently have access to toilets and are trying to get them, or even as we adopt more innovative toileting technologies here in this country, even bidets, right? It's like the new technology is always in conversation with the culture. And how do you, and how do we, with hopefully the best of intentions, work together to shift them in ways that are mutually desirable and not like this is what I'm saying, and you have to do it this way. So maybe that's an entry point to talk a little bit about, the history you dug up from the past, because obviously, poop is as old as people, if not older. So, how have communities wrestled with these challenges in the past, or have they even been challenges? Did communities see them differently at other times?
I did a lot of research about that. It was one of my, I think, favorite parts of my historic research, to find that how differently different communities dealt with it. So I would say that uniformly, you could see that even our Neolithic ancestors wanted nothing to do with their shit. They wanted to get rid of it. But there were a few communities throughout history that had a very different view of their waste. And I think this is a good moment to read from my book again, because I have this really amazing example that totally blew my mind when I was researching it. So we're talking Japan. At some time during the Tokugawa period in Japan, the magistrates of the coastal city of Osaka received an air quality complaint. Residents who lived near the port objected to the foul smell that emanated from some of the docking ships. A thriving urban sprawl, Osaka welcomed many merchant boats, domestic and foreign, that delivered tea, rice, silk, fish, and other goods. But among those boats came other vessels that carried much less agreeable cargo, human waste. These boats cleared the city of its daily shimagoye, as the Japanese called their sewage. In Japanese, the word shimagoye literally means fertilizer from the bottom of a person, and it roughly translates into English as night soil. Brought to the wharves by the shimagoye collectors, the waste was loaded into the boats' bellies. But instead of being dumped into the sea or on a remote island where the Japanese put their other less useful garbage, it was shipped to farmers outside of the city of Osaka. The valuable shimagoye went on to nourish crops for the people who produced it. And as the city grew, so did the amount of night soil it generated. More boats came to take them away the mammoth loads. Eventually, it generated such a stink that the city protested. The authorities considered the problem. On one hand, the complaint had merit, the Japanese country valid cleanliness. On the other, banning the sewage ship from the port would cause not one but two major problems. First, it would cripple the city's waste disposal system. It was the only one. And second, it would leave farmers without the fertilizer and the urbanites without the produce they very much needed. And that both would cause an uproar. So after much deliberation, the authorities ruled that it was unavoidable for the manure boats to come into the wharves used by tea and other ships. So to some, especially to us now, this decision may seem unhygienic at best, but to the Japanese, the ruling was logical. Japan did not have an abundance of natural resources or large swaths of fertile land. Its soil, sandy and nutrient-poor soil would bear very meager crops without fertilizer. So compared to Europe, where we had, forests, we could always cut down a few trees and clear, some new plot of land. They didn't have that option. So the Japanese never expected much from a new plot. A Japanese saying, a new field gives but a small crop, epitomizes the agricultural challenges the culture faced. So, and that's what I kind of saw throughout my research in geographical locales that were not very easy to farm, not easy to develop. So the soil wasn't quite there. Societies learned to be extremely thrifty and creative by using the fertilizer they produced themselves, from their own bottom. So Japan was not the only culture who valued their night soil. Osaka had about 1 million people at the time, but in China, the cities were even bigger. It was a city of 3 million people. There was a city of 6.5, and all these people had to eat. So in 1700s, the Chinese emperor issued a decree that prescribed that all people had to treasure the night soil as if it were gold and gather every ounce. It was really interesting to see how they did it. Those efforts were usually very organized in both places, in China and Japan. The night soil middlemen were called FNFU, and they wielded these little carts through the streets collecting waste from homes. And those who didn't have carts would carry them, pretty much like my grandfather did, in buckets. And what was interesting is neither the waste collectors nor the waste itself were stigmatized in any way, because everybody understood what it was for. So this metabolic output of the city was sailed onto the country and then processed, spread, dried, and sorted according to its value. Notably, not all dark matter was created equal. The one gathered from the richer locales sold for more money, because people were supposedly had better diets, so they produced more nutrient-rich output. Those were like really interesting methods. Another interesting thing I found was that in early 1900s, we here in America tried to glean some of that wisdom. An agricultural scientist, Franklin Hiram King, who once had been a chief of USDA Bureau of Soils, traveled to Asia to look at these permanent agriculture methods, and wrote a book called Farmers for 40 Centuries, in which he sort of laid out this agricultural wisdom. But lo and behold, a lot of that never really germinated.
It just is, I mean, it's so fascinating. I was thinking this images of, we so often talk about modern extraction as opposed to regenerative societies. And there's nothing else I can think of in this moment that is as much a metaphor of that extractive methodology or paradigm than to be like, well, let's just cut down a few more trees, work this land till it's fallow, and then cut down a few more trees. And as opposed to what you see in these places where things are much more challenging, it's a whole different paradigm about how do we reuse. And also that paradigm of taboo, again, right? Like night soil says nothing about poop. It says nothing about people. It's completely covered over, whereas fertilizer that comes from the bottom of a person is like, there's no doubt what we're talking about. It reminded me of in the book, you talk about how people, I think it was in China, how it was rude for a house guest to leave after a meal without going to the bathroom in their, like the people who fed them. It was like stingy, like that jerk, he took his poop home with him.
Exactly, couldn't pay us back nicely. It was kind of a generous and polite thing to do. The other thing that really shocked me is like to what extent these people really valued it. I mean, the Japanese actually measured its value in gold. For example, the price of night soil produced by 10 households in a year was worth half a rio of gold. And to put in perspective, 1 rio could buy all the grain one person needed to eat for a year. I mean, it's serious math in there.
Puts it into a different context. And I also just want to hold up that, like, if someone, I think for so many of us, maybe not you or I, but for many people, if someone came over to your house and pooped in your toilet, I think there's a fair amount of people who would be like, oh, I can't believe you, exactly. Why didn't you wait till you got home, right? Like, it's just a totally different, as you said, a sense of like, this is valuable, this is normal, this is a part of our everyday lives, as opposed to like, I pretend that this is not a part of my everyday life. And the fact that you've forced me to confront that poop comes out of my butt and yours is like, I don't want to do it. And so it's interesting because I feel like there's a lot more research you did about also the Flemish culture, and I believe as well Rome and places where things weren't quite as cyclical in their nature. But it really does show that there were a wide variety of ways to address sanitation. And then in the modern context as well, we've seen some of this science kind of recreated, both in examples, maybe you want to talk about, I think, Pullman near Chicago, and there, you mentioned it briefly, but also in modern wastewater treatment plants.
So somewhere around like 18 and 1900s, there was a really interesting concept. I think there were people, people and scientists and engineers at the time, some of them were realizing that we are basically wasting, our resources and, throwing them out or flushing them down the drain. And American railroad engineer George Mortimer Pullman built a novel state-of-the-art sewage recycling system in Pullman, which at the time was sort of outside Chicago, and now is part of Chicago. It was his company town on Lake Calumet. It was a manufacturing town of about 8,000 residents surrounded by farmland. And when he did the research, he decided there was really no good way to get rid of the sewage because the lake was kind of small and shallow, and that sewage would basically have nowhere to go. So what they built instead is they built this, system of radiating pipes that went out of the city, and propelled by the steam engine, the waste of the town residents would travel through like a 3-mile long pipe and arrive to a farm. What I thought was really interesting is that the system actually worked. It worked for almost 20 years, and it pumped 2 million gallons of sewage daily, and it irrigated 140 acres of land for almost 20 years. How did it end and why did it end? Well, it's kind of your classic. The person who stands behind it all dies. So Pullman died in 1897, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. There were some of the sewage farms built in Europe at about the same time, but for one reason or another, it would never last long. I think it's our own, aversion to the topic. The fact that these systems need maintenance. They need, tender loving care, just like everything. You have to do it right. If you over fertilize too much, your plants actually won't grow. They need just the right amount. There's certain science that goes with it. So sewage farms lasted for a while and kind of died out.
I love it. Even a sewage farm needs tender loving care, just like the rest of us. I think you also mentioned in the book that the people who worked at the farm were very clear that vegetables grown from the fertilizer, from the sewage, was tastier than vegetables they could buy otherwise at market. And I think, you're also, I was joking for myself, like that person who doesn't leave their poop at the friend's house where they ate is probably where we got the phrase tight ass. And the ships that couldn't be redirected in Osaka must be where shit out of luck came from, because there is this human understanding that at some point we have to confront that if you want to have a bunch of people and you want those people to have food and you want them to be in a concentrated place, the shit has to go somewhere. And so I think it's interesting because while Pullman's model didn't exactly at that time proliferate, we do still have these systems that are able to take all of the municipal sewage from a giant city like Chicago, New York, or DC, and sometimes there still is a product that's brought to farms. So could you speak a little bit about some of those? I want to, and I know especially as we're getting on to about 20 minutes till the end, if folks who are listening in have questions that they want to ask, please put them into the chat. But maybe we could touch a little bit on biosolids reuse, municipal sewage, also on biogases to begin.
Yeah, sure. So I think, out of all my research, TC was my favorite. Just because I know that's where it happened to be. Just because the whole system was so beautiful. I remember I was there, I think in 2018 in the fall. And so I'm standing on top of this observation platform, and below me there are 24 colossal pressure cookers that are slowly cooking shit. You can hear this, in the air. And if you think about it, 2.2 million people, and you see all of this comes there. I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so there's poop here from Tyson's Corner, the Smithsonian Institution, the Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol Hill, the protesters, everybody. And the engineer who took me around, Bill Brower, his official title was a resource recovery engineer. It's important, not a wastewater management, resource recovery engineer. We were kidding around. He was like, that's where all of us come together. And I thank you, all these people, for their contribution. He's an awesome guy. So generally, the plant itself kind of follows this idea. There's no such thing as only wasted resources. So what happens there is the sewage stream comes in, it goes through various aeration tanks, what it has to do, and then it's loaded up into these pressure cookers that cook it at I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, and I can't, but something like 300 degrees Fahrenheit and 6 atmospheres. So it's a pretty intense, pressure cooking. So what comes out has no pathogens in it. Everything's dead. It's just like huge amount of mud, like your classic black mud. So the mud is loaded up into these biodigesters with various bacteria that's supposed to live in sewage and eat it, chew through it for a while, something like a couple of months. In the process, they burp out biogas, which is mostly methane with some added impurities. And while doing this, they also reduce the amount of sewage significantly. So it's a lot less to deal with at the end. So that is the biogas the plant uses to generate electricity and do whatever they need to do for their own needs. And the output then is dewatered. There's this really interesting conveyor belts that sort of like squeeze water out of this mud. And the end result is basically garden dirt. It is the same garden dirt that was in my grandfather's pits. That was just, it smelled so awesome. It smells exactly the same way. And I couldn't help it. I had to dig into it and hold it. And it just immediately invoked memories of food, how plants grow, and it was just so beautiful. So this product is called Bloom. It's packaged into bags of and sold as organic fertilizer grade A, meaning safe to use in homes and gardens and anywhere else, and you can buy it in DC stores. So that is, one really good example. And it's my favorite because it becomes of like immediate use. If I lived in DC, I would be buying it.
I would like to say that I am, but we don't have a place big enough for a garden.
Part of the project, yeah.
Yeah, but I think I just want to note you invoked again your grandfather, and I think it's one of something I really believe in my work and how I try to approach this work, and I think you do too, is that this is a wisdom we understand in our bones. We understand this because we came from soil and we go back to soil, from dust to dust. And whether you believe that theologically, it's biologically pretty clear, so there's a sense of reconnecting us to that deep wisdom and love that we have for the earth and for coming from the earth. You mentioned biogas briefly, and in the story of Bloom, but your book has a lot of different ways that biogas is being used. Maybe we could just briefly touch on that. What is biogas, and what are some of the possibilities that are becoming available to us from that technology?
So biogas is a product of bacterial digestion. The process is so complex that I actually could not find a single chemist who would explain me this exactly what happens inside these biodigesters, because you can't really look into them quite well. And it's you can just sort of like approximate all these chemical reactions, but biogas is mostly methane with some impurities that can be cleaned, and so eventually you can have methane and you can do pretty much anything you want with it. You can burn it to spin turbines to generate electricity. You can cook with it, which is what some of the startups and sanitation startups do in the developing world. Mostly they use it for cooking. And in some, I think somewhere in the UK, they've also been trying to run buses on that methane that that comes from a sewage plant. Yeah.
Right. And you wrote about some versions, that I think that can be as big as these municipal versions that we talk about, but also as small as like a lazy boy, that there could be a point where each of us in our houses could have a biodigester that can take our organics, our food scraps, and also our poop and power our stoves or go into a larger grid somehow.
Yeah. So the poop part might be a little bit further away, but yeah, in some ways it is pretty close, especially for people living in the grid communities. It's actually really awesome solution. I thought of getting one here in New York I'm not, I just really don't know how I'm going to make it work, especially with a rat population here. You can't really leave it outside, I don't think. So there's a company in Israel called Home Biogas. And so what they sell is essentially a miniature, digester that comes in a box. The last time I checked, like $600 to $750 dollars. They started originally with food leftovers. So you would load in a bunch of food leftovers. You would start the whole thing once with the certain amount of bacteria that you need to, insert there. And then they just sort of live and procreate. And they keep eating, chewing through this waste and producing, biogas. So what happens is you put like all this waste through, on one end, and what comes out is biogas, through which travels to your stove through a pipe and burns beautifully. And the other thing that comes out from the rear end is sort of like this goopy browny liquid that accumulates in the pail, which is that kind of like a liquid form of that fertilizer that can be poured on your vegetable patches. And there's a way to sort of kill pathogens if you want. Before it, you can put a little chlorine tablet in there. So it goes through the chlorine tablet, eventually chlorine evaporates, but before it evaporates, it kills everything. So you end up with just a classic organic fertilizer you made yourself. So they've experimented with a version of that attaches to your toilet, and it works. It's just there's no way to attach it to a porcelain jar in your house. It has to be one of those water-saving toilets that you kind of like pump to flush. Again, I wish I could use one here where I live, but at the moment I don't see how it fits. Maybe one of the future versions will fit.
Yeah, it's one of those complicated things, again, in that nested problem scenario of like, if we were to isolate this problem, we have a solution for it. But inside of the urban infrastructure we already live with, our buildings, et cetera, things get a lot more complicated. One challenge that I think is really being navigated that we haven't touched on so far is the medical possibilities of poop. And this has been, I think it's been making headlines a little bit. I mean, certainly with COVID and sewage, I got sent 2 news articles this week about that already. It's only Monday, but also for fecal transplants. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what are the medical possibilities of inside of our bowels right now, the new miracle drug.
Yeah. So that's actually, I could probably say that this was a story that started it all, like, kind of like moving towards my book. Almost 10 years ago now, I came across this woman who was basically dying from C. difficile. It's an infectious disease that most of the time people get when they're in the hospital and they take a massive amount of antibiotics. Antibiotics kill the proper intestinal microbiome, and somehow this bacteria settles in, and everything else is dead. So it takes over, gives people almost nonstop diarrhea. People get dehydrated. It's and it seems that once you get it, it returns, because even the most powerful antibiotics that we have can't really clear it. It keeps coming back. And it's basically a superbug. So she kind of used up all of her options. I think it was her 5th or 6th bout with it, and somewhere on the internet she found a write-up about the fecal transplant. And what it basically is you take poop out of healthy people and you put it into the sick person. And the idea is that you don't transfer just poop, you transfer the whole microbiome, the right intestinal ecosystem, the healthy one. And because they're healthy and they're all in the right proportions, they're just going to colonize the new intestines and make this person healthy again. They chase away the C. diff. And that's exactly what happened. So the way they did it, because it was before such treatments became even possible in medical settings, her husband deposited his poop into this special container. He put it in a blender. He mixed it out with an enema liquid. He pushed the button, made what he called a milkshake. It looked exactly like milkshake with his descriptions, just, smelled anything but, and gave her a fecal transplant enema. And she recovered literally immediately within hours.
Yeah.
So she couldn't get out of bed for months, before, couldn't get out of the house for months, couldn't barely get out of bed for weeks. And within like 24 hours, she was completely back to normal. And she wasn't the only person. When the fecal transplant movement, for lack of a better word, started picking up speed, it happened, people realized that this is what happens. It's like almost instant. But it was still a very unknown type of treatment, and treatments like that always bother the authorities. They make them worried, because nobody really knows, will it always work like that or not? And so in my book, I talk about the fact that the FDA was going to put sort of like stricter, more restrictions over the whole process. And they were having an event where various medics were present, discussing whether this should become a mainstream treatment or not. And the ultimate conclusion was no, this shouldn't be a main type of treatment, because we don't really understand it. She happened to be at that event, and when she heard that it was basically going to be discontinued, she was so upset, because there were other people dying from it right now. So she walked up to the podium and did this passionate speech, talking to the people about the fact that nobody knows how to treat this disease. You keep this works. Until you know how to do it, just keep this. And guess what? The FDA sort of allowed it as sort of emergency type, one of a kind, special situations, treatment. So yeah, I don't know about all of us, but a lot of us, well, some of us definitely carry that special power within.
Yeah. And I think I have so many thoughts, but one that it points again to that extractive versus regenerative model, where antibiotics say we're going to come in and we're going to kill the bad thing. Fecal transplant therapy says we're going to come in and help to repopulate the good stuff. We're going to give you all the defenses that you've been missing, and create a broader network, a diverse coalition, as opposed to like target something and go in there. But also, I just want to call out, like, that for me in reading the book, I laughed so hard while reading about what the husband had to do this process. And I cried. I literally cried. I was walking around listening to the audiobook, and I came back in the apartment, and my partner was like, "Are you okay?" It's like tears are streaming down my face when she came to the podium to make her speech. It's so well done. So I actually would love to hear, maybe, I know, especially as our time is beginning to come to a close, firstly, if there's any questions from our gathered live audience, please do submit. But also, so I'd love to hear also some, like, what the process of putting a book about a stigmatized issue was like, any praise, but also I'm just curious, like, did you have a Google Doc of euphemisms? Did you collect adjectives? Like, I don't know, earlier when you were talking, you said you were talking about smoothies and this brownie and all these different words that I feel like this happened a lot as I read the book. You're like, oh, that is a delightful way to talk about exactly what you're talking about in a way that is a little bit around it, or sometimes really on the nose. Like, how did you go about editing and writing something that would be both funny and scientific and heart-opening at the same time?
I did use a lot of puns, and actually I've heard it from more than one person. People were asking me, how did you come up with so many synonyms and way to call it, that other dark matter of ours, different names. I don't know exactly. I always been the one for the synonyms for everything, just so that it wouldn't create the echo. I just kept thinking of it. I think, like I said, I had such a different upbringing that I never had any aversion, to it. It was always part of life, and to the point that, like, I always understood, like, life doesn't happen without it. Food doesn't grow without it.
Right.
So I guess I have just kind of like a certain appreciation for it. So it was easy to come up with all these different, metaphors.
But I just want to acknowledge too, your aversion is it's not that you have no aversion. I think part of what makes the book so readable is you're not like, and then they showed me a giant bucket of poo and I was like, I'm gonna dip my hand in, you know. You have many very human reactions of like, and I was like, that's disgusting, I hope I don't vomit, you know. And then eventually you work your way towards like and I think we, again, in our culture, we have a lot of psychological contamination that poop affords us. It contaminates our space if we use the wrong word, you know, for it. There are ways in which it has a feeling of negative connotation even when nothing has happened. But so it takes sometimes the science. Like I'm remembering a passage where you don't want to touch some biosolids because even though you know that they're scientifically safe to touch, there's just still fear, you know. And
yeah, it's true. I mean,
yeah,
I guess you kind of need a balance, right? You need to understand what's healthy and what's not healthy. Yeah.
Well, and so far it seems like you've struck a pretty good balance, because the book has been very well celebrated by some other fantastic authors in the field of similar books. Mary Roach, Elizabeth Colbert in the New York Review of Books, right?
Yeah, I think all in all, I was very lucky. So like when I had kind of like a moment of panic right before the book came out, I was like, what was he thinking about? I was writing a book about poo. Like, who the hell's going to read it? It's a failure. It's just going to tank. And then, the Nature and New Scientist profiled it in their roundups. Publishers Weekly called it. It's a take on waste that's anything but wasteful. My own alma mater, Columbia University, was so funny. They wrote, if someone told you that the most optimistic book they read in a while was about human waste, you might think they were full of it. I love that. I love this thing. Then Mary Roach said, anyone with a colon should read this book. And yeah, the Elizabeth Colbert was like the most recent surprise, because she devoted a page and a half of beautiful prose to this book. It was just happened last week, and I was like, wow, wow. So
yeah, well, and here's a review coming in from one of our live audience members. Pete says, I've been listening to the book on Audible while driving. It's a fabulous book that has me saying, oh wow, no way, so true, every couple of minutes.
I see that. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, well, Pete and I do for chat. That's for sure. So I think we're like approaching 4:00 here in New York, so we should probably wrap up soon. I'm thinking I should probably just say like the last, if I were to leave my readers and listeners with one thought, like what would I say? And I think what I would say this so many issues in sanitation, whether in developed or developing world, stem from the fact that we try to kind of pretend it doesn't exist, or it's ugly, no, bad. And I think that's what I wanted to change with the book. I wanted people to understand that this is an extremely valuable substance that all of us produce fairly regularly. And the way I look at it is, humans are super poopers. You produce extremely valuable metabolic product, and it's called people's own organic power of poop, just like Shawn calls it. Yeah, the planet needs it, the soil needs it, the circular agriculture needs it, the economy needs it, even the energy industry needs it. So humans love the shit, treasure it as if it were gold.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Lina. As I like to say, love from the bottom up. Thank you for putting this fantastic book out into the world. Nicholas, I feel like you're going to give us some info about how we should sign off today.
I just wanted to say thanks to both of you again. That was amazing. And thanks to everyone who attended. I'm going to put the link to the book at the Seminary Co-op in the chat again. And that's all. Everyone have great days.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so much.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.